These are the battles of the War of 1812. This is number 4 in our look at what happened during that war, and we're into 1813, the spring of that year, and the capture of York. York used to be the name of the city of Toronto, and by the time the spring of 1813 came along, the Americans had a much more powerful presence on Lake Ontario than the British fleet based out of Kingston. In other words, the Americans were building ships like crazy. The British were just bringing ships that they weren't using in the Napoleonic Wars. And this allowed the Americans to launch an amphibious invasion. In other words, an invasion where they took land soldiers and they landed them off ships across Lake Ontario to attack the upper Canadian capital of York, now Toronto. And at that time, you have to imagine, if you know Toronto really well, the waterfront of the city of Toronto was about a kilometer farther inshore. In other words, we've gained about a kilometer of land going out into the lake, mostly through construction and stuff like that. We'll learn more about that when we go to Fort York. But by that time, you could literally go right into the area of around Toronto through the straits. There were no islands, or not too many islands that were there, not like it is today. So an American army landed on April 27th, and after a really nasty battle with the British, were forced to retreat from York. Okay. But as the British were abandoning the garrison of York, because they realized that they were not going to be able to hold it, they set a fuse to their gunpowder magazine. And the explosion that went caused so many American casualties, including one of their generals, Zebulon Pike, after whom Pike's Peak in Toronto is named, that the Americans turned around and came right back, and they accepted the surrender of York, took over the town for a few days, burned the government buildings, including the Parliament and the shipyard, and then went back to Sackett's Harbor, New York, where their main naval base was for Lake Ontario. Now, this wasn't taken lightly, because it was one of the reasons for the retaliation and the burning of the White House, the Capitol building, and other government buildings in Washington, D.C., when they occupied that city in 1814. But it was the first defeat that the British had had in the now one-year-old War of 1812. The next was May 27th, 1813, at the Battle of Fort George. Now, it took place just a month after the capture of Toronto. The Americans planned to attack Niagara to use this as a bridgehead so they can take over southern Upper Canada. And on May 25th, a whole bunch of American cannons started shelling Fort George. And it destroyed almost all of the fort's wooden buildings. A couple of days later, an amphibious American army of more than 5,000 men, which was bigger than most of the ones that they had put into place so far, overwhelmed the defending garrison of Niagara. They were outnumbered 3-1 when they showed up. The Americans took over Fort George, the town of Niagara, which is now Niagara-on-the-Lake, and for 7 months. But they weren't able to launch any further conquests. They just couldn't use it as a springboard. Plus, they had a couple of nasty things happen to them at Stony Creek and Beaver Dams, which we'll talk about later on. And when they got down to it, they just couldn't hold on to it because they were constantly under attack, not only by the British, but by militia and especially First Nation allies. The Americans left the fort and went back across the Niagara River. They burnt the town of Niagara on their retreat. That happened later on in the year, around December 10th. And the British took over Fort George again. What they did is they came in, helped find shelter for all the inhabitants of the town, and then they retaliated. They attacked Fort Niagara on the American side later in December and burnt the American villages along the Niagara River, and they'd take over Fort Niagara for 15 months, and they only finally left it after learning that the treaty that ended the War of 1812 was signed in 1815. So you can see there's a little bit of back and forth here. The Americans have had a couple of positive things happen. They've had a couple of victories. They continued, though, to lose overall in the war. The British, on the other hand, are fighting battles in very far-flung places, and they have only a few men to spare. It's basically falling on the militia and their native allies to hold back the Americans. So far, so good. But now we start looking at the summer of 1813, going into the fall and winter, and seeing if any changes begin to happen as the War of 1812 continues.
Created using Powtoon.